vision entière, un enthousiasme dans laquelle rien de durable ne pourra être réalisé.
Thank you, and it's very much an honour for me to be invited to give this lecture. And I perhaps take as my starting point your closing observation. My view is very much that Britain needs Europe. It's not for me to judge how much you think you need the UK. What we are experiencing in the UK, but not just in Britain, I think this is more widespread, is a serious questioning in significant parts of the political world of the European project. And that's why I wanted to respond to the challenge which Robert Schuman poses. If we go back to him, the founding father of the European Union, and just review what he said and what he did in order to get our bearings in dealing with the problems of today. His project was initially a very modest one. It was France and Germany working together on coal and steel, the big divisive issues of the previous century. But this then enlarged into the coal and steel community, and then into the European economic community, the single market, and the European Union we have today. It started modestly, and he claimed with modest aspirations, but it developed into this remarkable institution. And lest we forget, this is the most ambitious multilateral organization in the world, and has succeeded in many levels. And what are they? If we just take the very basic points, first of all, we no longer live in fear of war within Europe. We take that for granted, but it was an achievement. It didn't happen by magic. We solve disputes, of which there obviously are many, but through debate and compromise and cooperation. We have, through the European project, absorbed countries that were previously under military right-wing authoritarian government in Southern Europe, and then under communism, and all of which have been successfully assimilated. And lastly, and this is the problem now, we have assumed, and by and large over the last half century achieved, a cooperative approach to economic policy and economic growth and prosperity. And that is the bit which is now the problem area, because the current position is difficult. The European Commission's own forecast is of GDP growth next year, the rest of 2015, of about 1.5%, of which 1% is within the Eurozone, and that includes a great deal of stagnation and possibly in some countries a fall in living standards. We have unemployment levels averaging 10% and 11.5% in the Eurozone, which is not a politically sustainable level. And we now have the new problem of potentially of deflation. The figures for last calendar year suggest that prices actually fell a little. Deflation isn't necessarily a major problem if it's driven by productivity, as it was in the 19th century. It's something which can enhance living standards. But in a modern context, and certainly in the way we look at economics today, deflation potentially opens up a regression into serious depression in economies, and is therefore a genuine source of alarm. Now, the reason why this is a problem is because of the impact of economics on politics. And what we're seeing throughout the European Union, whether in the Eurozone and out, is a backlash which expresses itself in different ways. We have a revival of what I call identity politics, no longer about left and right, about business and social democracy, but about nationality, nationalism, anti-immigration, issues around religion, and it's certainly in the case of the United Kingdom, a questioning of the value of the European Union. And in my country, this expresses itself in several ways. We now have a significant party whose support is roughly around 10% in opinion polls, but that fluctuates a great deal, and now has 2 members of parliament, sees itself as a growing force, which is unambiguously for total withdrawal. They have significant allies in our main centre-right party, the Conservative Party, and within the Conservative Party you've seen a steady drift over the last few years to arguing for reform, not so much working partnership with like-minded Europeans, but shouting from the outside. And we're also beginning to get a commitment to spending the next 3 years arguing about a referendum. And I speak as somebody who is a veteran of the referendum 40 years ago, and I participated in it. This one will be different because the last one involved the centre and the right arguing against the left, and this one will involve the centre and the left arguing against the right. And it takes place under less propitious conditions, because in the 1970s it was possible to argue that by joining the European Union, this will enhance our economic performance because the European Union is so dynamic. That's not the condition today. So we're in a difficult political situation. And the reason I want to speak to you about it is because I think that the central argument we now have to get across is that the European Union is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And in order to demonstrate that it is part of the solution, we need to be able to show that the European single market works and delivers economic success. And what I want to argue for, and I argue as a pro-European liberal in Britain, is for a major effort to make the single market work. And I think that this has several elements to it. I think, first of all, it has to be fully digitized, and that's the major theme I'm going to talk about today. Secondly, it's got to enable services to be delivered throughout the European Union, because we are increasingly in a service-based economy. Thirdly, it allows freedom for individuals to work. In other words, the pillar of the single market, which is free movement of labour, has to be upheld. That probably is the big dividing line at the moment in the UK debate, because on the right there is now increasing resistance to that principle. And fourthly, we should be using our position in the European Union to access world markets, the United States at present, but our relationships with China, India, Japan, and other countries too. So let me just take each of these 4 subject areas and suggest how we might use them. Just a quick word about the economics of this. Essentially, what I'm arguing is that you can achieve improved economic performance, high living standards, through what are sometimes called supply-side reforms. Now, I don't want to imply that that's what economic policy should be about. I'm also a Keynesian, and I believe that demand is crucial. There is a major debate, of course, within the Eurozone about expansionary monetary policies and fiscal policies, where I'm broadly on the side of Mr. Draghi and his team. But we're not members of the Eurozone in the UK, so it's not my role to give lectures on how the Eurozone should conduct its demand management. That is obviously crucial to growth. But in addition, And whatever happens to demand management, it is necessary also to have good supply-side reforms, and those are the issues on which I want to focus today. Now, first of all, why is the digital issue so important, and why is it so central to growth within the European Union? First of all, the figures tend to suggest that in the world's advanced economies, about 20% of the growth that we have experienced has come from this sector. We've done some quantification in the UK that suggests that the ICT sector, which is roughly the digital sector, is growing at about 3 times as fast as the rest of the economy. And I suspect that something rather similar is being experienced in the rest of Europe. What does a digital economy actually mean? I think we're talking about several different things. It's not just a narrow business issue. What I think a single market in digital means, it means, first of all, in the public sector, for example, that there is 24/7 access to public services and information through government. It isn't simply, we're not simply here talking about a private sector phenomenon. We're talking about something that is equalizing. In other words, it is giving access to European citizens, information, goods, digital content, everywhere in the European Union, not just in cities, not just in the north as opposed to the south. So there's some very important fundamental principles underlying the concept of a digital single market. It is, of course, about choice and competition, but there are deeper principles involved in doing it. And there are some very, very good examples across the Union about the progress that's already been made. I understand that Estonia, for example, now has the closest approximation to a digitally based government. We're trying, but I think Estonia is the furthest ahead. I think Belgium is often cited as probably the best example of high-speed broadband connectivity. Wherever I go in the UK, I get complaints that we don't have it. But I think there are parts of Europe that do, and I believe Belgium is the leader. France, I was surprised by this, but I gather that France has the most advanced online banking, 70% usage so far. And in the field of e-commerce, this is where the UK and Finland, I think, have the 2 most advanced systems in the world, more than the United States, for example. So there are a lot of things happening. It isn't that we're starting from base zero. There is already a significant degree of digitization in particular countries. However, there are significant limitations, and these are some of the limitations we would need to address if we had a genuine digital market within Europe. For example, there are 28 national markets, all with their own laws and rules, which can be very restrictive. It's actually very difficult to set up a European-wide digital business that compete globally because of this degree of fragmentation. To take one concrete example, there is Netflix, which some of you probably have access to, getting the equivalent of a DVD online to show films. This is not accessible in quite a few European countries. To take another example, which is highly controversial in some of our countries, Uber. We've had strikes of taxi drivers in the UK. In some countries in Europe, it simply isn't possible to operate because it is effectively being blocked. This isn't unremittingly difficult. There are other examples which are more positive, that although it is actually quite difficult to do financial settlement in Europe, if I can just illustrate that point, in the UK we've established that a lot of UK purchasers would prefer to buy cheaper goods online, but they won't do it across European frontiers because they're afraid of settlement. problems and achieving a refund if you have trouble with your supplier. But that is in partly been overcome by a company called TransferWise. So there are good and bad here. There is a very patchy digital economy, some of it happening, some of it lagging behind. And I think what we now need to focus on, although the digital single market is a nice phrase, it trips off the tongue, but what does it mean? And what exactly is it that we now need to try to achieve? And I think the way I would specify it is by saying there are certain requirements in respect of individual consumers, and there are certain requirements in respect of companies. Now, in respect of individuals, consumers, I think what we are wanting to aspire to is a European Union in which it's possible to buy digital products and services and use them anywhere within the European Union, in the same way that we can with goods. We should be able to go online anywhere in the European Union on the same terms that we have at home. From a consumer point of view, that is essentially what the objective is. In the case of companies, I think what we should be aspiring to is that companies only need to register once in order to operate online access. At the moment, they have to register many times in different countries. And we also need to be able to ensure that new entrants are not frozen out of existing markets. Essentially, in order to help early adopters, often insurgent technologies, there needs to be across the European Union common definitions, technical standards, and simple contracts. And actually, I think this is the answer to those people who worry about these big American companies, Google, Amazon, and the rest. There may be genuine reasons to worry about market dominance and why they don't appear to pay taxes, and these obviously are genuine issues, but the real response is not to try to destroy their capacity to innovate, which undermines all of us. It should be to ensure that we operate within a European Union in which insurgent companies, European companies, can break in, do not have to face the artificial barriers of 28 different countries. Having said all that, I do recognize that delivering this is not going to be straightforward. There are genuine reasons why people in different countries worry about aspects of a digital single market. In Germany particularly, there are anxieties for perfectly good historical reasons, people worrying more than elsewhere about privacy, and that has to be respected. But I think I would simply say that for companies who now operate in this space, companies who are trying to offer profit-making services in things like the cloud, it is absolutely in their interest to protect individual privacy, because otherwise who would use them and who would trust them? So we have to respect the concern for privacy, but it's not done by blocking the emergence of a genuine single market in this area. Similarly, I'm absolutely supportive of people who ask awkward questions about Google and Amazon's tax payment policy, but you don't deal with that problem by tying them up for 4 years in a competition investigation. That doesn't help anybody. This is a fast-moving industry. Of course, we need to have tax cooperation within the European Union and more widely in the OECD, but we've got to deal with it in a constructive way that doesn't stifle innovation, which is the danger here. So I think the fundamental principle, what we should be trying to achieve, is that Europe is digital by default. That's the objective that we should be trying to achieve, and we can do that by having an open, vibrant digital single market in which consumers and businesses have confidence, and in which we have a positive approach to growth opportunities. I know Mr. Juncker is making this a priority for the Commission, and I hope it will advance in the way that I've described. Now, the second area, and I want to say a little bit less about these other subjects than about the digital single market because they're already well-trodden territory, but is actually making real some of the commitments that have already been made about a service-based single market. We theoretically have a single market in services, but it's often not realized. And we have this totally artificial debate between services versus manufacturing. And I think people sometimes look at the UK as a country that no longer does manufacturing, and so therefore we have some vested interest in promoting a services-based economy. Well, this is nonsense. Actually, the main project in my 5 years as a minister has been promoting an industrial strategy in the UK. It has been promoting advanced manufacturing in aerospace and automotives and biological science. And I believe in manufacturing. However, what the figures tend to show us is that about 30 to 50% of all manufacturing jobs are actually service providing. They're providing services to that sector, and within it, roughly 20 to 25% of manufacturing output consists of services which are delivered to that industry. And so there's some very good economic analysis just come out of the OECD, which suggests that manufacturing exports are much more successful if they come from a highly competitive services industry. And so that's why we should see, in my view, manufacturing and services as complementary, not as competitive. And it puts an imperative on having an effective single market in services within the European Union, which we don't have. We use the jargon, but it doesn't happen in many areas. And certainly from my point of view, and I think the UK point of view, we want to see a real commitment to seeing this accelerated. Let me just give some concrete examples, so I'm not talking abstract. We have some world-class architects, Foster's, Hadid, and others. What happens at the moment is that they can win contracts in the Middle East, in India, in China, but not in other countries of the European Union. The whole process, the procedures are just so much more difficult. The same is true within the building industry. It is actually quite difficult for construction companies to operate across the European Union because surveyors, building contractors cannot obtain indemnity insurance that applies in all European countries. I mean, these are real practical problems that impose very real costs that a genuine liberalization of services would help to accomplish. So we certainly want to see better enforcement, prioritization of services in order to obtain some very real gains, and it involves getting into some very tricky areas like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and often for quite emotional reasons, it's quite difficult to get this. I discovered skiing late in life, in my 60s, but I was told that British ski instruction is not recognised in France. I mean, it may or may not be true. This may just be an urban myth, but certainly the British ski instructors I met felt that there was a lack of mutual recognition. I'm sure we do things also in the UK. But so the whole issue of mutual recognition, services liberalisation should be central. The third area is the free movement of people. And this is a particularly difficult issue at the moment because immigration has become a toxic issue in many of our countries. And the UK is as bad or worse than some others. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the British were champions of the single market. Now there is how do we stop people coming in from Europe is a very popular narrative. But if the single market is to mean anything, politicians have to stand up and be willing to defend freedom of movement within the European Union, freedom to work. Absolutely fundamental. And the data suggests that this is mutually advantageous. For example, we have 1.8 million Europeans, other Europeans, working in the UK. This is sometimes treated as a terrible burden, but actually they may take advantage of services in the UK, but there are a lot of British people, almost as many British people in other European countries, and those who are settled in the south of Spain have access to Spanish healthcare. And we've got to make it clear that this is a reciprocal arrangement, and there are mutual benefits. And the empirical evidence suggests very clearly that the migrant workers from Europe that we attract into the UK, mostly from Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, and more recently the Balkans, is that almost all of them come to work, almost all of them pay tax, they are younger, they work, and they support an aging population. And the economic benefits of it are very real. But unless we can defend this principle, we are potentially in considerable difficulties. And I think that does mean accepting that in some cases there is a real issue of public trust. We do have this debate in the UK at the moment about what's called benefit tourism. There are a few people who are abusing the system. There are some genuine irritations, like the fact that family benefit, family allowance as we used to call it, is paid to people who, say, come to Britain from Poland to work, and then they go back home and their children still get these benefits. I think these are the kind of things which rankle, which arouse a lot of hostility in the popular press. And there are some abuses that we have to deal with. But the fundamental point is that we must defend the freedom of movement of workers within Europe. Without that, the whole concept of a single market goes. And my final point relates to the capacity of the European Union to open up world markets. So we're not just thinking internally within Europe. It's worth recalling that Schuman, in his original vision of Europe, described it as something that could further development of international trade. And I think we do need to remember historical experience, that if we were to get into a downward spiral of protectionism, the consequences would be very dire. We have just been through a major economic crisis following the collapse of the banking system. We had a similar experience in 1929, 1930. What happened then were tariffs introduced in the United States, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. The British retaliated, the Italians retaliated. Eventually, world trade was effectively destroyed, and we fed the nationalism which contributed to the Second World War. And we must not allow that to happen again. The top priority is to maintain the momentum in the World Trade Organization globally. That's proving difficult, but we've got to try. But the main practical project is the TTIP, the negotiations with the United States, potentially of very, very considerable value. In practical terms, European countries are struggling to enter the United States through high tariffs. Ceramics is a good example. There are areas where our companies cannot operate effectively in the United States because of the duplication of standards. The car industry is an example. And there are many outright barriers, Buy America policies in the United States, which are blocking public procurement. And they would say there are similar obstacles in Europe. And the potential gains from eliminating these are very, very substantial. But I think we're all aware that this is proving a hard sell. In the UK, I think Germany even more, there is now a popular resistance to this. Some of it is outright protectionism. Some of it is a hostility to globalization, a retreat from trade. Some of it is based on very specific worries about the dilution of standards, about the excessive rights, as some people see it, given to international companies through the ISDS agreement. And I think we need to provide a strong defense against this populist resistance to further trade liberalization. And I think the central points we would need to deliver on that are to be absolutely clear that this is not about diluting European standards or putting public services at threat. We've said that, but it needs to be emphasized, that there needs to be complete transparency as far as possible. Obviously, if you're negotiating, you don't say what you're going to do tomorrow, but being as explicit and transparent as possible, and making sure that elected representatives have the final say. But this is something that has to be delivered, because if it fails, it will be a recognition that we've reached the limit of trade liberalization and we're retreating back into more nationalistic forms of activity. So to try to draw the threads together, I think we potentially could make enormous progress by trying to achieve a Europe which is, first of all, digitally connected, taking full advantage of technology. Secondly, is globally connected through trade negotiations. And thirdly, is free of internal frontiers, whether it's to services or to people. And I think if we do that, we can galvanize economic activity, deliver a dividend for European people, and thereby help to neutralize the very toxic and negative political feelings which many of us are encountering in our home countries. So thank you very much for your attention.